Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
We begin with tensions rising potentially between the U.S. and China with a red headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal. President Biden is imposing sweeping tariffs on China. Let's get the details now from Bloomberg's Steve Potusk in Washington.
In an election year move, the president is hiking tariffs on a wide range of Chinese imports, including semiconductor chips, batteries, solar cells, and critical minerals. The White House says the changes are projected to affect around $18 billion in current annual imports. The moves represent Biden's most comprehensive update to the China tariffs first imposed by Donald Trump. It's a recognition that a hawkish approach to trade with Beijing remains popular with voters. None of Trump's tariffs will be reduced. Biden will ratchet up rates on goods the U.S. struggled to import during the coronavirus pandemic and for key industries like chips and green energy that he's sought to bolster since he took office. Still, Biden must strike a careful balance. Additional tariffs risk increasing prices for consumers already hurting from inflation. It also could inspire the ire of China, which could choose to retaliate in kind. In Washington, Steve Potusk, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Steve, thank you. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says she hopes China will not retaliate to any coming trade restrictions. Speaking exclusively to Bloomberg, Yellen said China is really not playing by the rules.
We do think that the playing field should be fair, and China engages in unfair practices like massive subsidies of industries they have decided are critical. And those are cases where we will act to protect ourselves.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen added that the U.S. cannot allow these emerging sectors to be wiped out by Chinese competition. Get the full conversation on the Bloomberg Talks podcast feed.
And sticking with geopolitics, Karen, the Biden administration is giving an in-person show of support to Ukraine. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Kiev. He's highlighting the battlefield gains Ukraine could make with $61 billion in just past U.S. assistance. Polish President Andrzej Duda says Russia cannot be allowed to win in Ukraine.
If they manage to win in Ukraine, if they manage to accomplish their goals, they will keep on attacking. They will attack other countries. Perhaps these could be the Baltic states. Perhaps this could be Finland. Perhaps this could be Poland. Or perhaps these could be other countries which used to be part of the Russian sphere of influence.
Polish President Duda spoke through an interpreter with Bloomberg News editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite at the Qatar Economic Forum in Doha. Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Ukraine comes as Russia has mounted one of its biggest attacks since the invasion more than 2 years ago in the northeastern region of Kharkiv. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told Blinken Ukraine needs 2 air defense batteries to protect Kharkiv from Russia's attacks.
Well, Nathan, back here in the U.S., the star prosecution witness in the hush money trial against Donald Trump returns to the stand this morning. And we get the details from Bloomberg law host June Grasso in New York.
The Michael Cohen that jurors saw on the stand was subdued and unemotional, just answering the prosecutor's questions without any hint of his ill feelings toward Trump. His testimony is the most damaging against the former president so far, giving a first-hand account of Trump allegedly directing him to falsify financial records to cover his hush money payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels. The test will be whether Cohen can be shaken on cross-examination. In New York, June Grasso, Bloomberg Radio.
June, thanks. Turning to the economy now, Wall Street gets the first of 2 key inflation reports this morning with the release of the Producer Price Index for April. And we get a preview from Bloomberg's Michael McKee.
Inflation week kicks off with the Producer Price Index. Headline wholesale prices are expected to rise 0.1 of a percentage point on the back of higher energy costs. Core PPI, however, is forecast to fall back, resuming the downtrend in inflation that was interrupted at the start of the year. Producer prices don't translate directly into consumer price changes, but do offer an overview of the inflation picture. The CPI is released tomorrow. They also provide a picture of profit margins in some industries, including retailers. Michael McKee, Bloomberg Radio.
Mike, thank you. Well, in company news, sources say Walmart is axing hundreds of corporate jobs and asking most remote workers to return to offices. Companies around the world are encouraging employees whose commutes were reshaped by the pandemic to return to offices. Walmart, the world's biggest retailer, is also the largest private employer in the U.S. and operates some 4,600 stores domestically.
In markets, Karen, meme stocks are once again in focus following monster gains for GameStop. Let's get the details from Bloomberg's John Tucker. John.
And Nathan, GameStop surged 119% at one point. This all started when the investor known as Roaring Kitty suggested he was back after a 3-year absence with a cryptic post on X. By the end of the day, GameStop's market cap increased by $4 billion. Trading was halted for volatility 9 times within the opening 90 minutes of trading. That rally spilled over into other meme stocks. AMC Entertainment, that surged 78%. Well, this latest rally, though, is short of the 2001 frenzy when GameStop surged 2,000%. This time, only 24% of the stock is sold short. Checking shares of GameStop and AMC this morning, they're both up more than 37%. John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John, thank you. Well, banking is also very much in focus this morning. We caught up with several CEOs at the Choose France Summit in Versailles. Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan says U.S. consumers helped by wage growth remain in good shape even amid elevated interest rates.
It shows you the resilience of the American consumer. Rate structure may be higher, and we can talk about that, but the reality is it's in decent shape. There's 1,000 things that can go wrong tomorrow, but right now everything's in pretty good shape.
In an interview with Bloomberg's John Farrow, Moynihan says consumer spending climbed 3 to 4% in May from a year ago.
And we also spoke with Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon in France. Karen, last year, Solomon found himself under pressure amid slumping profits at Goldman. Fast forward, the bank's stock recently hit record highs thanks in part to a first quarter jump in net income.
When times are good, things feel good. When times are tougher, things don't feel as good. But we kind of take a long view, execute against that strategy, and we just know that if we have really, really smart people working together, working collaboratively, really driving for excellence to serve our clients, we're going to do just fine.
Goldman's David Solomon says after a long quiet spell, the market for initial public offerings has opened up.
Nathan, it wasn't just banking leaders that we caught up with at the Choose France Summit. We also heard from a world leader. France's President Emmanuel Macron said he'd be open to the takeover of a major French bank by a rival in the European Union to deepen financial integration in the region. Macron told Bloomberg News editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite that the European Union needs a fresh approach to business.
Dealing as Europeans means that you need consolidation as Europeans.
So it could be cross-border mergers in both directions.
This is a totally new world, and we do need this new business model for the Europeans. More innovation, more investment, single market and capital market union, and a relevant trade policy.
And that's French President Emmanuel Macron. Hear the full conversation and all of our newsmaker conversations from the Choose France Summit on the Bloomberg Talks podcast feed on the Bloomberg Terminal and at Bloomberg.com. And it's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Ceasefire talks have apparently stalled between Israel and Hamas. It comes the United Nations confirms an aid worker was killed and another injured after their vehicle was struck in Gaza yesterday. Another aid worker was wounded. A spokesman says Israel Defense Forces were not made aware of the vehicle or its route. Meanwhile, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan pushed back against criticism of Israel's actions inside Gaza. Sullivan says while they have some concerns on some of the IDF's conduct, they don't believe it rises to the level of a genocide like some claim.
We believe Israel can and must do more to ensure the protection and well-being of innocent civilians. We do not believe what is happening in Gaza is a genocide. We have been firmly on record rejecting that.
Sullivan says the U.S. still believes it would be a mistake to launch a major military operation in Rafah. Jury selection continues today in the bribery trial of New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez. The Democratic senator is charged with taking bribes, including gold bars, cash, and a Mercedes to help send aid and weapons for Egypt and Qatar, and to stop a federal case against a friend and businessman.
Menendez's wife, Nadine, is also charged but will be tried separately and later this summer. It has been almost 2 years since a mass shooting took the lives of 10 people and injured 3 others at a New York State Tops market. New York Governor Kathy Hochul went to Buffalo to unveil the design for the 514 memorial honoring the victims. Hochul talked about the powerful outreach of the community immediately following the tragedy.
It didn't break us. Instead, it revealed a strength that runs deep in the veins of this city. The strength of a community that binds together and refuses to be defined by acts of hate.
The victims, who were black, were killed by a white supremacist in the attack. Maryland, Nebraska, and West Virginia hold presidential primaries today. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg, Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. It's time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update with John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. The Rangers with a second chance to finish off the Carolina Hurricanes at the Garden. They got a shorthanded goal second period from Jacob Trouba. Took that 1-0 lead to the third when the Canes scored twice in a span of just over 3 minutes, and they weren't done there.
Trouba will give it away to Natchez out in front. Martin scores! Natchez to Martinook, and it's an offensive explosion in the third period. Carolina has a 3-1 lead.
99-9 the Fan. Hurricanes added an empty netter, won 4-1, and suddenly this series has gotten very interesting. Game 6 not until Thursday in Raleigh, where the Canes are tough to beat. If there's a Game 7, it would be on Saturday at MSG. Where tonight it's the Knicks and Pacers. Game 5, series tied at 2. Oklahoma City and Dallas tied at 2. OKC beat the Mavs 100-96. Celtics now 4-0 on the road. They won in Cleveland 109-102. The Cavs had to play without the injured Donovan Mitchell. Boston got a combined 60 points from Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. They lead the series 3-1. It's opening night in the WNBA, and how much of a difference does Caitlin Clark make? The Connecticut Sun tonight hosting Clark and Indiana have sold out their near 9,000-seat arena. It's something they haven't done since their first game ever in 2003. Mets spending the week with the Phillies, who have baseball's best record. 2 games at Citi Field and 2 in Philly. Mets took a 4-2 lead to the 9th inning. Phils tied it off Edwin Diaz and then won 5-4 in 10. The full schedule comes out tomorrow, but the NFL leaked out that opening night, September 5th, will be Baltimore at Kansas City. Battle of the 2-time winning MVP quarterbacks Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes. Detroit's QB Jared Goff just agreed to a 4-year contract extension. He'll make $53 million a year. Only the Bengals' Joe Burrow makes more. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports.
Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon spoke with Bloomberg's Jonathan Ferro about the federal deficit, the economy, and opportunities around the globe. Let's go to part of that conversation.
The level of debt in the United States, the level of spending is something that we need a sharper focus on and more dialogue around than what we've seen. We obviously had a pandemic. We made a bunch of decisions, in that pandemic, but we're long out of that pandemic, and the spending levels, are continuing at a pace that I think is raising our debt level and creating issues for us down the road. We're obviously in an election year, so I'm not, I don't have my head in the sand. I don't think you're going to see that get a lot of attention prior to the election, but I do think it's something that requires focus. We need to deal with the debt and the deficits, and, hopefully there'll be a lot more discussion as we come through the election and move into the next administration.
Well, let's give it a bit of time now if we can. I often say that the United States has the privilege of behaving recklessly sometimes that maybe the likes of the Europeans do not. Have you sensed there's been any kind of pushback from the Treasury market, from investors, against the backdrop and this risk that we're talking about currently?
The reserve currency is a great privilege. I'm not going to sit here and say that I see in the near term, a threat to that in any way, shape, or form. But it's not something that you can take for granted. And the United States' ability to spend without constraint is not unlimited. Ultimately, the market will challenge that. Hasn't challenged it yet. I'm not saying that's something that's coming soon, but it's certainly something that we should be very cognizant of and very protective of.
Do you think the experience of the UK a couple of years back was maybe a case study for what we could face in America?
Well, that was a disruption to the gilt market, and it's one of the things I think you need to be concerned about. It's a risk issue I've highlighted before. At the time, the Bank of England had to reverse its course and become very accommodative to deal with that blip in the markets. We've had disruptions of the Treasury market before. We certainly had a disruption in March 2020. To the degree that we had a significant disruption in the Treasury market sometime in the future, we don't have a lot of capacity through the banking system to intermediate that. It would require very accommodative policy. If that came at a time where that was not right for the central bank to be accommodative, that would be a risk issue that would have to be monitored.
We've had some big moves in the last 3-4 months. I can just think about the start of 2024. We were looking ahead to maybe 7 rate cuts priced into markets from the Federal Reserve, went all the way down to none. I think Jan Hatzius and the team are down to 2, July and November. Big swings in equity markets too, David. Can we talk a little bit about that? I think we're seeing 10% swings in trillion-dollar names post-earnings. Is that good for business, that kind of market environment? Is that what you want to see?
The market's the market. And, I think there are a handful of things that are driving these platforms to grow earnings very significantly and gain a larger importance in the overall market capitalization. These hyperscalers, as they're called, I think have enormous competitive advantages in the world that we're operating in. And it's not been surprising, given some of the changes in technology in the last 12 months, that their market caps have accelerated. I don't worry about that from a market perspective. I think markets are relatively efficient. I do worry that the structure of the equity markets, particularly in the United States, but this is true all over the world, are bringing fewer and fewer public companies. And that is concerning. There's obviously an abundance of capital available in private markets. But I do think it's important that we have open, accommodative, strong public markets. There's tremendous disclosure, transparency in public markets. I think that's good for capital deployment. And I am concerned that the breadth of the public markets is getting a little bit more narrow, and I think that's something for us all to watch and think about.
That was Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon speaking with Bloomberg's Jonathan Farrow, and you can catch that entire interview on the Bloomberg Talks podcast. Download all our high-profile discussions on Apple, Spotify, and everywhere you get your podcasts. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, SiriusXM, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.